It is the 26th of March, 1991, and somewhere over the skies of southern Iraq, a lone F-15 Eagle is climbing hard. The war is barely over, a ceasefire signed just days before, but the desert below still smolders. Captain Thomas Dietz of the 4th Fighter Wing out of Seymour Johnson Air Force Base has his radar humming, his eyes scanning a sky that should, by now, be empty of threats. The coalition ground forces have swept through Kuwait. Saddam Hussein's army has largely collapsed. The 100-hour ground war they'll write about in history books has come and gone, leaving the desert littered with burnt-out tanks and abandoned equipment. But the sky is not empty. Dietz picks up a contact. It is fast, extraordinarily fast, moving at speeds that only one aircraft in the world is truly built for. The silhouette resolves on his radar, and even before visual confirmation, there is little doubt. It is a MiG-25 Foxbat, one of the most feared interceptors ever built by the Soviet Union, now flown by a desperate Iraqi pilot pushing his aircraft to its absolute limits in a last act of defiance, or survival, or perhaps both. If you've ever wondered what it actually felt like to sit inside the cockpit of history's most capable air superiority fighter while it hunted the aircraft that had, for 2 full decades, kept the entire Western world awake at night, this is that story. If you find yourself drawn to these lesser-known stories of the air war over Iraq, consider subscribing. There's much more where this came from. To understand why an encounter between the F-15 and the MiG-25 mattered so deeply, not just tactically, but psychologically, even historically, you have to go back to a specific afternoon in 1967. Not to a battlefield, but to an airshow. It was Domodedovo Airport, outside Moscow, and the Soviet Union put on a display unlike anything Western intelligence analysts had ever witnessed. Among the aircraft that roared across that grey Russian sky was something that looked less like a fighter jet and more like a missile with wings. Long, angular, almost brutalist in its design. It climbed nearly vertically after takeoff. It accelerated to speeds that seemed to defy physics. The analysts watching, whether in person or through grainy reconnaissance photographs that arrived days later, struggled to make sense of what they had seen. The aircraft was designated the Yi-155 by its designers at the Mikoyan-Gurevich Bureau. The West would come to call it the MiG-25. And for the better part of a decade, it would become the single most alarming symbol of Soviet aerospace capability. The numbers were staggering and, to Western planners, deeply unsettling. The MiG-25 could fly at Mach 2.8 in sustained cruise, roughly 1,850 miles per hour, and was theoretically capable of touching Mach 3.2 in a brief sprint, though doing so at that speed would destroy the engines. It had a service ceiling of approximately 78,000 feet, well above the reach of nearly every interceptor in the American and NATO inventories. It carried 4 large air-to-air missiles. And from its first public appearance, it seemed to represent a fundamental shift in the balance of air power. The American response was immediate, urgent, and expensive. Within months of those first disturbing reconnaissance photographs, the United States Air Force began drawing up requirements for a new aircraft, one specifically designed to counter the MiG-25's extraordinary performance envelope. The program would eventually produce what many consider the finest pure air superiority fighter ever built, the McDonnell Douglas F-15 Eagle. But here is where the story becomes genuinely strange. The aircraft that launched the F-15 program, the aircraft that consumed billions of dollars in American defense spending, that reshaped an entire generation of American aerospace doctrine, that became the measuring stick against which every Western fighter was judged, was, in fundamental and rather embarrassing ways, not quite what it appeared to be. To understand the gap between the MiG-25's fearsome reputation and its actual capabilities, you need to understand something about the nature of the Cold War intelligence problem. Western analysts in the late 1960s were working largely in the dark. They had photographs. They had occasional signals intelligence. They had the performance data from the Domodedovo airshow, which Soviet engineers had almost certainly optimized for maximum psychological impact. What they did not have was an aircraft they could take apart, examine, fly, and measure against their own machines. So they extrapolated. And in extrapolating, they made assumptions that were entirely reasonable given what they knew, and almost entirely wrong. The prevailing assumption in the early 1970s was that the MiG-25 had to be equipped with advanced avionics, a sophisticated fly-by-wire control system, and likely a look-down, shoot-down radar capability, technology that would allow it to track and engage targets flying below it against the radar clutter of the ground. This last capability, if true, was particularly alarming. American and NATO aircraft flying low to avoid Soviet air defenses would, in theory, be completely vulnerable to a MiG-25 hunting them from altitude. The aircraft was also assumed to be highly maneuverable at high speeds, a dogfighter as well as an interceptor. The reasoning was straightforward. Any nation capable of engineering an airframe that could sustain Mach 2.8 in level flight must surely have solved the aerodynamic and structural challenges of high-speed maneuverability as well. None of this was unreasonable. The problem was that it was wrong. On the 6th of September, 1976, a 29-year-old Soviet Air Force's pilot named Viktor Belenko flew his MiG-25 from a base in the Soviet Far East, dove below radar coverage to evade interception, and landed at Hakodate Airport in northern Japan. He was defecting to the West, and he brought with him the most complete intelligence gift of the entire Cold War. American, Japanese, and other Western technical teams descended on Hakodate within hours. The Japanese allowed an exhaustive examination of the aircraft, and what the engineers found over the following weeks fundamentally, and rather humblingly, revised every assumption Western intelligence had made. The MiG-25 was not a sophisticated, all-weather, multi-role interceptor. It was, in the most literal sense, a brute force solution to a specific problem. The airframe was constructed largely of welded steel, not the advanced titanium alloys analysts had assumed would be necessary for sustained Mach 3 flight. Steel. Heavy, relatively cheap, and far simpler to manufacture than the exotic materials that American engineers had imagined. The welds were, by Western standards, rough and industrial. The overall construction quality, while functional, was not refined. The electronics told an even more revealing story. The radar was powerful, genuinely impressive in its raw output, but it was vacuum tube technology. Not transistors. Not integrated circuits. Vacuum tubes, the same fundamental technology that had powered radios in the 1940s. This made the system heavy, power-hungry, and far less capable of the sophisticated signal processing that would be needed for a true look-down, shoot-down capability. The radar could see a great distance in ideal conditions. But it was, in a fundamental way, a blunt instrument. The controls were manual and heavy. There was no fly-by-wire system. No advanced stability augmentation. Pilots who flew the MiG-25 described the controls as sluggish at high speeds and demanding considerable physical effort. At Mach 2 or above, the aircraft was essentially locked into whatever flight path it was on. You did not maneuver a MiG-25 at high speed. You pointed it and held on. The range was limited. The fuel consumption at high speed was extraordinary. The aircraft could sustain Mach 2.8 for only a matter of minutes before fuel exhaustion became an immediate concern. The operational combat radius was roughly 1,100 kilometers at subsonic cruise speeds, dropping dramatically at any kind of sustained high-speed profile. And perhaps most importantly for the F-15 program that had been launched specifically to counter it, the MiG-25 was, in any kind of turning engagement, essentially helpless. It was not a dogfighter. It had never been designed to be one. It was a point defense interceptor, designed for one mission: climb fast, reach altitude, accelerate to intercept speed, fire missiles at a large, non-maneuvering bomber, and return to base. Everything about its design, the heavy steel construction, the powerful but crude radar, the enormous engines, the limited fuel load, was optimized for that single task. The assessment that followed the Belenko defection, classified for years and only partially declassified decades later, was blunt in its conclusions. The MiG-25, the aircraft that had launched the F-15 program and reshaped American air superiority doctrine, was not a peer competitor to the F-15. In a visual range turning fight, it would be destroyed. In a beyond visual range engagement at the Foxbat's optimal speeds and altitude, it was dangerous. In any other scenario, it was deeply limited. The F-15 program, of course, continued. The aircraft that had been designed to fight a terrifying Soviet superinterceptor turned out to have been designed to fight a somewhat less terrifying Soviet aircraft with a remarkable top speed and considerable limitations everywhere else. But the F-15 itself had been designed with such margins, such excess capability, that this revelation did not diminish the aircraft. If anything, it meant the Eagle was even more dominant relative to its intended adversary than anyone had originally hoped. The F-15 Eagle that took shape at McDonnell Douglas through the late 1960s and into the 1970s was, by any engineering measure, a remarkable machine. The requirements set out by the Air Force in 1969 were demanding almost to the point of impossibility given the technology of the time. The aircraft had to be capable of sustained Mach 2.5 flight. It had to have a thrust-to-weight ratio greater than 1, meaning it could accelerate while pointing straight up. It had to carry a powerful pulse Doppler radar with genuine look-down shoot-down capability, the very thing the MiG-25 demonstrably lacked. It had to be able to engage multiple targets simultaneously. And it had to be a superb close-in dogfighter, with a high thrust-to-weight ratio, excellent visibility from the cockpit, and control systems responsive enough for the kind of sustained turning combat that had proved so decisive over Vietnam. The aircraft that emerged from those requirements, the F-15A, which first flew in July of 1972, met nearly all of them. The twin Pratt & Whitney F-100 engines produced roughly 23,800 pounds of thrust each in afterburner, giving the aircraft a clean thrust-to-weight ratio of approximately 1.3 at combat weight. The wing loading was deliberately kept low. The wing was large relative to the aircraft's weight, which gave the Eagle exceptional turning performance and the ability to sustain tight turns at high speed without bleeding energy catastrophically. The APG-63 radar was, for its era, extraordinary. It could track targets at ranges beyond 100 miles in ideal conditions, maintain track while scanning, and genuinely look down through ground clutter to find low-flying aircraft, the capability that had so alarmed American planners when they wrongly assumed the MiG-25 had it. The radar fed targeting data to the aircraft's 4 AIM-7 Sparrow semi-active radar homing missiles, 2 AIM-9 Sidewinder heat-seeking missiles, and the internal 20mm M61 Vulcan cannon. The cockpit was designed around a philosophy that would later be described as HOTAS, hands on throttle and stick. The pilot could manage weapons, radar modes, and defensive systems without removing his hands from the primary flight controls. The wide-angle heads-up display gave a continuous stream of flight and weapons data. The ejection seat was tilted back 30 degrees to help the pilot tolerate high-G maneuvers. The Eagle entered service with the United States Air Force in 1976, the same year, somewhat ironically, that Viktor Belenko's MiG-25 landed in Japan and began to reveal just how differently the two aircraft had been designed. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the F-15 accumulated a combat record in the hands of the Israeli Air Force that was genuinely unprecedented in modern aviation history. Israeli F-15s were involved in engagements over Lebanon and Syria, fighting Soviet-built MiG-21s, MiG-23s, and Syrian Air Force aircraft equipped with the latest Soviet weaponry. By the time the smoke cleared over the Bekaa Valley in June of 1982, the same month Argentine A-4 Skyhawks were sinking British ships in the South Atlantic, Israeli F-15s had accumulated a kill ratio in actual combat that most Western air forces had considered theoretically possible but practically unattainable. The number was 82 aerial victories. 0 losses. The figure seemed almost too clean to be believed, and indeed the precise accounting of any air combat is always subject to dispute and fog. But the broad picture was unmistakable. The F-15 was not merely a capable aircraft. In the hands of well-trained pilots with effective doctrine and good situational awareness, it was devastating. And yet, for all of this history, for all of the development money and the combat record and the intelligence revelations, the F-15 and the MiG-25 had never met in direct, sustained aerial combat. They had existed in parallel threat assessments and war games and classified simulations. But the actual meeting of the two aircraft in a real shooting war had not happened. Until the Gulf War. When Iraq invaded Kuwait on the 2nd of August, 1990, it possessed one of the largest and most diverse air forces in the Arab world. The Iraqi Air Force operated hundreds of Soviet and French-built aircraft, MiG-21s, MiG-23s, MiG-29s, Mirage F-1s, Su-25s, Su-20s, a mixture of types that reflected decades of arms purchases from multiple suppliers and a doctrine built around both air defense and ground attack. Among these, perhaps the most operationally significant, and certainly the most psychologically charged, given its history, were the Iraqi MiG-25s. Iraq had acquired the MiG-25 in the 1980s, primarily in the reconnaissance variant, designated the MiG-25R, and the interceptor variant. The reconnaissance versions had been used extensively during the Iran-Iraq War of 1980 through 1988, conducting high-altitude, high-speed photo runs over Iranian territory with near impunity. The Foxbat's speed made it essentially immune to Iranian interception attempts. It could outrun anything Iran possessed. This had given Iraqi MiG-25 pilots a particular kind of confidence, a bone-deep familiarity with their aircraft's strengths, and a professional reliance on speed and altitude as the primary survival tools. Operation Desert Shield began in August of 1990, and the coalition air buildup in Saudi Arabia that followed over the next 5 months was unlike anything assembled since the Second World War. At its peak, the coalition air forces numbered more than 2,500 aircraft from multiple nations: American F-15s, F-16s, F-111s, A-10s, B-52s, Navy F-14s and F-A-18s, British Tornadoes and Jaguars, French Mirage 2000s, Saudi F-15s and Tornadoes, and dozens of other types in supporting roles. The F-15 contingent was substantial. The 33rd Tactical Fighter Wing, the 1/2 Fighter Wing, and the 4th Tactical Fighter Wing, later redesignated the 4th Fighter Wing, were all deployed to the theater, operating from bases in Saudi Arabia. Together they represented the most concentrated deployment of America's premier air superiority fighter in history. On the 17th of January, 1991, Operation Desert Storm began with one of the most intense air campaigns ever conducted. In the first 24 hours, coalition aircraft flew more than 1,000 sorties against targets across Iraq and Kuwait, striking air defense radars, command centers, airfields, and communications nodes in a deliberate effort to destroy Iraq's ability to coordinate its own defense. The Iraqi Air Force responded, but cautiously, and then less and less. In the first days of the war, Iraqi aircraft rose to contest coalition air operations with something approaching genuine intent. The result was rapid and instructive. In the opening phase of Desert Storm, F-15 crews destroyed 33 Iraqi aircraft in aerial combat. Iraqi pilots attempting to engage the Eagles, even those flying the relatively capable MiG-29, which was in many respects a much more modern and capable aircraft than the MiG-25, found themselves at a systematic disadvantage. The coalition's AWACS aircraft provided continuous tracking data. The F-15's radar and long-range missiles allowed kills before Iraqi pilots were even aware they were being targeted. Within a week, the Iraqi Air Force had largely stopped contesting coalition air superiority. Aircraft were dispersed to hardened shelters. Some, famously, were flown to Iran, a decision that revealed the depth of Iraqi desperation, since those aircraft would never return. But a handful of Iraqi pilots kept flying, and some of them were flying MiG-25s. The decision to keep flying MiG-25s during Desert Storm was not irrational, even given the overwhelming coalition air presence. The Foxbat's speed remained its greatest asset, and Iraqi commanders understood this at a doctrinal level even as their air force disintegrated around them. A MiG-25 flying at Mach 2.8 at 60,000 feet was, in purely physical terms, an extraordinarily difficult target. The missiles of the era had limits. The geometry of a high-speed, high-altitude intercept was demanding even for the best-equipped fighter in the world. And the reconnaissance variants in particular had a legitimate, urgent mission: to observe coalition ground force movements and report back what they saw. So the Foxbats kept flying. Mostly at altitude. Mostly fast. Mostly alone. And the F-15 pilots hunting them learned, very quickly, that the encounter they had trained for, the one that had shaped American air superiority doctrine for nearly 2 decades, was nothing like what the classified briefings had suggested. The first serious engagement came on the 17th of January, 1991, the opening night of Desert Storm, when Captain Steve Tate of the 71st Fighter Squadron downed a Iraqi Mirage F-1 with an AIM-9 Sidewinder. But it was the daylight engagements that followed in the days and weeks after, when Iraqi MiG-25s made their high-speed runs through coalition-controlled airspace that produced the encounters that pilots would discuss for years afterward. What struck the F-15 crews who engaged or attempted to engage Iraqi MiG-25s was not the Foxbat's lethality. It was its behavior. The Iraqi MiG-25 pilots, almost without exception, did not fight. When they detected, or more often, when they were simply told by ground controllers that F-15s were in the area, the response was immediate and consistent. Afterburners lit. Nose pointed away. Maximum speed, maximum altitude, maximum distance between themselves and the Eagle. The aircraft that had haunted Western planners for 2 decades, the interceptor that had launched the F-15 program itself, consistently chose to run rather than engage. This was not cowardice. It was, in a deeply professional sense, correct doctrine applied to a hopeless tactical situation. Iraqi MiG-25 pilots were not fools. They understood their aircraft. They knew the Foxbat's strengths, speed, altitude, the ability to simply refuse an engagement by outrunning anything that came after it. They knew its weaknesses, the terrible maneuverability at high speeds, the limited radar capability, the fuel consumption that made any prolonged engagement a fuel emergency. They also knew, by January of 1991, what happened to Iraqi pilots who tried to fight F-15s in any kind of maneuvering engagement. The answer was written in the kill tallies from the first week of the war. So they ran. And in running, they revealed something important about the entire 20-year narrative that the MiG-25 had generated. The Foxbat had always been a specialized tool. Its designers at the Mikoyan-Gurevich Bureau had never claimed otherwise. The design requirements specified an aircraft optimized for high speed, high-altitude interception of American B-58 Hustler and B-70 Valkyrie bombers, both of which were cancelled before the MiG-25 entered service, leaving the Foxbat without the threat it had been designed to counter. The terror the aircraft had generated in the West was, in large measure, a product of incomplete information, understandable extrapolation, and the psychological dynamics of Cold War competition. The aircraft was real. Its speed was real. Its ceiling was real. The threat it represented, in the specific role it had been designed for, was real. But the broader implications that Western analysts had drawn, the multi-role super-interceptor that outclassed everything in the Western inventory, had been, as Viktor Belenko's defection had begun to reveal 15 years earlier, largely a projection. The F-15 pilots who found themselves chasing Foxbats across Iraqi airspace were not disappointed. Exactly. They were experiencing something more nuanced than disappointment. They were experiencing the strange sensation of having prepared for one war and finding themselves fighting a different, considerably more one-sided one. The engagement that crystallized all of this most sharply came not during the opening strikes of Desert Storm, but in the final days of the war, and in its immediate, technically still ceasefire aftermath. On the 11th of January, 1991, before the air campaign even began, an Iraqi MiG-25 had already demonstrated something remarkable. Flying a reconnaissance mission at high altitude over Saudi Arabia, the aircraft had approached and overflown coalition positions with essentially no ability on the coalition's part to do anything about it in time. The Foxbat was at altitude, moving fast, and gone before an effective intercept could be set up. It was a reminder, filed quietly in intelligence reports, that the MiG-25's core capability, speed and altitude as a survival mechanism, was not a fantasy. But the war's air combat history is most precisely defined by a handful of specific engagements, and among those, several involve the MiG-25 directly. On the 26th of March, 1991, 5 days after the official ceasefire that ended Operation Desert Storm on the 28th of February, Captain Thomas Dietz of the 53rd Fighter Squadron, 4th Fighter Wing, was flying a combat air patrol over southern Iraq as part of the continuing enforcement of the terms of the ceasefire. The fighting was officially over. The ground war had lasted 100 hours. Kuwait had been liberated. But the skies over Iraq were not yet settled, and American aircraft were maintaining a presence to ensure Iraqi compliance. Dietz picked up a contact on his radar. The contact was moving fast, very fast, and heading south. The identification came quickly. It was a MiG-25 Foxbat. The geometry of the engagement that followed illustrated, in a very precise way, the entire history of the two aircraft's relationship. The Iraqi pilot, for reasons that remain unclear, whether ordered by ground controllers, attempting to conduct a reconnaissance run, or making some kind of final gesture of defiance in the war's closing hours, was flying south toward the coalition position. When the F-15's radar locked onto him, the Iraqi pilot did not turn and engage. He did what MiG-25 pilots throughout the war had done. He lit his afterburners and began to accelerate away. Dietz fired an AIM-7 Sparrow. The semi-active radar homing missile required continuous radar illumination from the launching aircraft, a constraint that made it difficult to employ against a target maneuvering hard to break lock, but the MiG-25 was not maneuvering. It was running in a straight line at maximum speed. The Sparrow tracked. The missile closed the distance to the Iraqi aircraft and detonated. The MiG-25 went down. It was, in the accounting of the Gulf War's aerial engagements, one of the last recorded air-to-air kills of Operation Desert Storm and its immediate aftermath. And it was accomplished not in the turning, slashing dogfight that Hollywood had taught audiences to expect, not in the close-range gut check of two pilots testing their nerve and their aircraft's limits against each other, but in a long-range, radar-guided engagement in which the outcome was, from the moment of missile release, almost geometrically inevitable. The aircraft that had launched the F-15 program died running away from one. Here, around this point in the story, it's worth pausing to examine what the Gulf War's air combat record revealed in its totality, because the MiG-25 engagements were part of a larger picture that was, by any historical measure, extraordinary. By the end of Desert Storm, F-15 Eagles had destroyed 36 Iraqi aircraft in aerial combat. The F-15's air-to-air combat losses in the Gulf War, 0. The kill ratio of 36-0 was not achieved because the Iraqi Air Force was uniformly incompetent. Iraqi pilots flying MiG-29s, a considerably more modern and capable aircraft than the MiG-25 in terms of close-in combat, demonstrated real skill in several engagements before being destroyed. The disparity reflected something systematic: the integration of the F-15 with AWACS radar coverage, with coalition communication networks, with the doctrine of beyond visual range engagement that American air forces had developed and refined through the 1970s and 80s. The F-15 almost never fought on even terms. That was by design. The entire philosophy of American air superiority doctrine, as it had developed from the lessons of Vietnam through the 1970s, was to never accept a fair fight. You found the enemy before he found you. You engaged at maximum range with the best available missile. You killed him before he knew you were there. The legendary dogfighting skills of American fighter pilots, the rolling scissors, the high yo-yo, the split S, were maintained and exercised and trained relentlessly, because the alternative to winning at long range was a knife fight, and a knife fight could go wrong. But the preferred outcome was no knife fight at all. Against the MiG-25, this philosophy was almost superfluous. The Foxbat was not going to knife fight anyone. Its pilots knew it. The doctrine reflected the aircraft's design. The tragedy, if tragedy is the right word for what happened to the Iraqi Air Force, was that a machine optimized for one specific mission in one specific Cold War context had been placed into a completely different conflict, against a completely different threat, by commanders who had no good options. There is one other piece of this story that deserves close examination, an engagement that took place not in the final days of the war but in its opening hours, and that revealed the MiG-25 in a different light entirely. On the 17th of January, 1991, as the initial wave of coalition strikes was still unfolding, an Iraqi MiG-25 fired an air-to-air missile at a coalition aircraft. The target was an F-15E Strike Eagle, a two-seat ground attack variant of the Eagle, from the 4th Tactical Fighter Wing, callsign *1. The pilot was Lieutenant Colonel David Eberly and his weapons systems officer was Major Thomas Griffith. The MiG-25, flying at high altitude and high speed, fired an Acrid missile, the R-40, a large, radar-guided weapon optimized for exactly the kind of high-speed, high-altitude engagement the Foxbat was designed for. The missile was fired from beyond visual range. The F-15E crew, focused on their ground attack mission in the opening hours of the most intense air campaign since Vietnam, received a radar warning that a missile had been fired at them. The missile missed. The circumstances of exactly why it missed, whether due to a defensive maneuver, a flaw in the Iraqi fire control solution, or the missile's own limitations, are not entirely clear from the available records. What is clear is that the Iraqi MiG-25 pilot had done exactly what the aircraft was designed to do: identify a target, achieve a firing solution at long range, and attempt a beyond visual range kill. The Foxbat, in those brief seconds, had been used correctly. It was, in the entire Gulf War aerial campaign, one of the very few moments when the MiG-25 actually behaved like the aircraft that had terrified Western planners in 1967. Fast, high, firing first, trying to kill at a range where the target couldn't respond. The aircraft that Viktor Belenko had shown the world was built of welded steel and vacuum tubes had, for a few seconds over the Iraqi desert, been everything the intelligence analysts had feared. It just hadn't been enough. In the months and years that followed Desert Storm, the Gulf War's air combat record was analyzed exhaustively by air forces around the world, allies, competitors, and adversaries alike. The conclusions drawn varied depending on who was drawing them, but several findings were broadly agreed upon. The first was that beyond visual range missile technology had matured to the point where the long-predicted revolution in aerial combat had, finally, substantially arrived. The AIM-7 Sparrow, for all its limitations and its decidedly mixed combat record in Vietnam, had performed considerably better in Desert Storm than in Southeast Asia, a product of improved variance, better training, and the systematic suppression of Iraqi radar and communications that left Iraqi pilots without the situational awareness to maneuver defensively when missiles were fired at them. The second finding was that the integration of airborne early warning, the AWACS aircraft providing continuous radar coverage and battle management, had been perhaps the single most decisive factor in the coalition's aerial dominance. F-15 pilots consistently knew where Iraqi aircraft were before those aircraft knew they were being tracked. In air combat, information is almost everything. The third, and in some ways most historically resonant finding, concerned the MiG-25 specifically. The Foxbat had entered the Gulf War with a reputation built on 2 decades of Cold War anxiety and incomplete intelligence. It exited the war having demonstrated, in actual combat, both the genuine core of what it had always been, a remarkably fast, remarkably high-flying aircraft that could not be caught when it chose to run, and the profound limitations that Viktor Belenko had begun to expose in 1976. It had killed no coalition aircraft. It had been shot down multiple times. Its pilots had, with rare exceptions, chosen to avoid engagement with F-15s rather than contest the airspace. The aircraft that had launched the F-15 program ended the Gulf War as confirmation that the F-15 had been the right answer, not because the MiG-25 was the threat it had been imagined to be, but because in designing an aircraft capable of defeating that imagined threat, the United States Air Force had produced something capable of defeating virtually everything else as well. Captain Thomas Dietz returned to base after the engagement on the 26th of March, 1991, and was credited with the air-to-air kill that was among the last of the Gulf War. He was one of the many F-15 pilots of the 4th Fighter Wing who would return home to Seymour Johnson Air Force Base in the weeks that followed, carrying with them a combat record that had exceeded almost every pre-war expectation. The 4th Fighter Wing's Gulf War tally was remarkable. Its pilots were credited with more aerial kills than any other unit in the coalition, a total of 16 air-to-air victories, adding to the wing's already formidable reputation as one of the premier Eagle units in the Air Force. For the men who had flown those missions, the experience produced its own particular kind of reflection. They had trained for years against a Soviet threat that had partly dissolved, against aircraft whose reputations had been built on information that turned out to be substantially incorrect. They had prepared for a war with the Warsaw Pact that never came, against MiG-25s that turned out to be far less capable than the worst-case analyses had suggested. And yet, none of that preparation had been wasted. Because the same qualities that would have been needed to fight a MiG-25 in the worst-case scenario over Central Europe, the superior radar, the long-range missiles, the integration with airborne early warning, the training and doctrine and operational procedures, were exactly what had produced the 36-to-0 kill ratio over Iraq. The F-15 had been built to fight a Phantom. The Phantom had turned out to be smaller than feared. But the aircraft built to fight it was real, and dominant, and extraordinarily effective against every threat it actually encountered. There is, in the end, a kind of historical irony at the heart of this story that is almost too neat to be entirely comfortable with. The MiG-25 was never the aircraft it appeared to be. Its most terrifying qualities, the speed, the altitude, the seemingly impossible performance, were real, but they existed in service of a narrow design mission that had become obsolete even before the aircraft entered service. The deeper capabilities that Western analysts assumed must accompany such performance were, as Viktor Belenko's landing in Japan had revealed, largely absent. The vacuum tubes and welded steel that constituted the Foxbat's inner reality were as different from the imagined Soviet superinterceptor as it is possible to be while still sharing an outer silhouette. And yet, the fear was not irrational. The incomplete information was not negligence. The intelligence analysts who looked at the photographs from Domodedow in 1967 and concluded that the Soviet Union had produced something extraordinary were doing their jobs correctly given what they knew. The decision to build the F-15 in response to that assessment was, given the information available, sound. The Cold War worked this way, repeatedly. Threats were assessed under uncertainty. Responses were designed for worst cases. Enormous resources were committed to countering capabilities that turned out, when the actual hardware was examined, to be considerably less formidable than feared. And in committing those resources, in building those responses, nations sometimes produced weapons and systems and doctrines that exceeded what the original threat had demanded. The F-15 Eagle is perhaps the purest example of this dynamic in the history of modern air power. It was the right answer to the wrong question. Or perhaps more precisely, it was an answer so comprehensively correct that it transcended the specific question that had prompted it, remaining dominant across 4 decades and multiple conflicts against threats its designers had never anticipated. The MiG-25, the aircraft that made the Eagle necessary, is no longer in service with any major air force. The last operational Foxbats were retired from Russian service in the early years of this century, their role taken over by the MiG-31 Foxhound, a genuine successor that addressed many of the original aircraft's limitations with considerably more sophisticated technology. The F-15, by contrast, is still flying. Updated, modernized, equipped with radar and weapons systems that the original designers could not have imagined, but fundamentally the same aircraft, the same wide wing, the same twin engines, the same philosophy of overwhelming capability married to pilot-centered design. The F-15EX, the latest variant, entered service with the United States Air Force in 2021, nearly 50 years after the prototype first flew. Export customers continue to receive new-build Eagles. The production line, opened in 1972 to build an aircraft capable of defeating a Soviet interceptor that turned out to be constructed of welded steel and vacuum tubes, is still open. The Phantom that launched it all is long retired. The response to the Phantom is still being built. That is, perhaps, the most honest summary of what the MiG-25's history teaches, that the fear was understandable, the response was extraordinary, and the gap between imagined threat and actual capability, while humbling to contemplate in retrospect, produced, almost accidentally, one of the greatest combat aircraft ever built. Captain Hartdyke, adrift on the upturned hull of his ship in the South Atlantic, watched his command sink into the grey water and felt the weight of a decision made in impossible circumstances. The F-15 pilots who chased MiG-25s across the Iraqi desert felt something different. The strange lightness of a threat that had, in the end, been less than feared. But both experiences share something fundamental: the collision between expectation and reality that defines the actual experience of war, as opposed to its careful, theoretical preparation. The Eagles hunted the Foxbats. The Foxbats ran. The story ended the way the engineering, in hindsight, had always suggested it would. But it took 40 years and several wars to find out for certain. If this deep dive into the air war over Iraq gave you something to think about, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one waiting. And if you want to go further, the video on when A4 Skyhawks sank the British is exactly the kind of story that sits alongside this one.